He wasn't a pilot. He was just a regular mechanic who got fired for telling the truth. But when his useless idea started saving hundreds of planes, even the generals stopped pretending they hadn't heard his name. You ever do something good, I mean really good, and get slapped in the face for it? That's how this all began. Not with glory, not with a medal, but with a clipboard, a busted weld, and a 17-year-old kid shaking like a leaf under a hot Ohio sun. It was May 1943, Dayton. The Fairchild plant was alive and deafening, like 100 anvils crashing at once. Heat hung in the air like punishment. You could smell molten metal and chewing tobacco before you even walked through the gate. The war effort didn't rest, and neither did we. 3 shifts, no overtime, and a thank you was something you were supposed to give yourself. I wasn't a pilot, never claimed to be. I was what they called a civilian technical specialist, which is a fancy name for you get paid less, but fix everything they break. I was the guy they called when something didn't make sense, but they never invited me to the meetings where things were decided. You get used to that kind of silence. That morning started like any other. A clipboard, a checklist, a mug of burned coffee I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. I made my rounds, frame line 7, section 4, double-checking reinforcement brackets on the tail booms. We'd had 3 structural failures in 4 months. Not combat hits, just bad design and corner cutting. And command, they blamed it on pilot misuse. Figures. So I did what I could do. Quietly, carefully, one sketch, one note, one suggestion at a time. At 3:20 that afternoon, I stayed late. Not because I had to, because I saw a kid on the verge of tears trying to line up a wing root bracket with a drill press that was chewing through more aluminum than it was saving. He was green, maybe 17, red hair, freckles, hands shaking like he'd just come out of a cold sweat. I stood behind him, not saying a word. He messed it up again, stripped the head. That bracket would never hold. "Let me show you something," I said. "You line up your elbow, not your eye. You trust your body more than your guess. Machines lie. Arms don't." He looked at me like I'd just told him how to fly. We fixed it. Together. I didn't log the time, didn't take the credit, just made sure the rivets would hold when some poor airman hit turbulence over France. And for that, I got called into the office the next morning. The office wasn't a place you got invited to, not if you were someone like me. It was upstairs, above the clanging floors and burnt oil air, behind a door that never squeaked. 3 men were waiting. One wore a uniform. The other 2 wore the kind of suits you'd never see on the factory floor. "Mr. Dole," said the man with the eagle pins, "you submitted an unauthorized engineering correction to the tail reinforcement schematic. That's a violation of military procedural protocol." Translation: You had a good idea, and we didn't like that it came from you. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached into my work satchel, pulled out a copy of my sketch. I'd traced the stress lines on the booms myself, spent 3 nights running torque simulations on a rig I built from scrap metal and chalk. My wife thought I'd lost my mind. "This bracket here," I said, tapping the line. "Add a tension loop across this support, and you get 18% less stress over the cross-section. No extra aluminum, no extra weight. Just smarter load distribution." The major didn't even look. "You're not an engineer of record, Mr. Dole," said the one in the suit. "We appreciate your concern, but these matters are better left to the chain of command." "The chain of command," I said slowly, is sending aircraft into combat with their wings ready to snap off if someone sneezes too hard. The silence that followed was thick enough to walk across. "Your responsibilities are on the floor," the third man finally said, in the kind of tone they use when they've already decided what you're guilty of. "You are hereby removed from all design and advisory work. Effective immediately." They didn't fire me. Firing would have required paperwork. Headlines, maybe. No, they just took away my voice. I walked out of that office back into the factory, and something in me changed. Not like a switch. Like a crack. Quiet, sharp, final. Nobody said anything, not my shift manager, not the kid I helped. Some of the guys looked away, others just kept hammering. That's how the system worked. Eyes down, mouths shut. Or you'd be next. I spent the rest of that shift tightening bolts on an engine strut that I knew was already out of tolerance. I logged it anyway. If I didn't, someone would say I missed it. I didn't eat that night. I went home to a quiet kitchen, a wife who tried not to ask questions, and a radio that wouldn't shut up about American innovation winning the war. I sat there, hands still dirty, wondering how many of those innovations were locked behind office doors and bad uniforms. You know what burned the most? They didn't even ask why I did it. Didn't ask if it could help, didn't ask if it was true. They just made sure no one would hear it. What happened next changed everything. You don't want to miss how this man, without wings, without rank, flipped the system on its head. Chapter 2 hits harder than you expect. Stay tuned. I was back on the floor the next day like nothing happened. You ever get punished in silence? Not a word, not a meeting, no memo on the board, just a quiet reassignment. A few heads turned, sure, but nobody said anything. That was the game. You start asking questions, and the next day you're scraping gum off supply crates in a different zip code. They didn't fire me. No, that would have been too obvious. They demoted me without saying the word, took me off design checks, removed my name from the workboards, reassigned me to quality inspections, which, let me tell you, is a nice way of saying, "Go count rivets." And just like that, my world got smaller. You know what that feels like. You try to help. You try. And the very people who tell you, do your part for the country, make sure your part doesn't go any further than a wrench and a clipboard. But I didn't quit. Couldn't. That wasn't how I was raised. My father laid bricks until his knees gave out. My mother scrubbed hotel floors until they turned blacker than her hands. They didn't complain. They taught me this. You do what's right, not what's rewarded. So I showed up. Early, stayed late. I checked bolts and rechecked beams, watched young bucks pass by with fancy badges and clean hands. Most of them fresh out of college, some of them with names that echoed down office halls like a family reunion. They called it supervision. I called it shadow work. But every now and then someone came to me quiet. Real quiet. "Hey, Al," one would say, eyes darting. "You mind looking at something?" I'd nod, and we'd step behind a bulkhead. Bad angle on a weld, improper seal on a stabilizer, off-center pressure tubing. I never made a fuss, never reported it. I just taught, explained, drew it in chalk on the floor if I had to, because these weren't bad workers. They were undertrained, overworked, and being pushed by the clock. That war wasn't just overseas. It was in every shift, every siren, every missed lunch. One night I found myself back at Station F, where they prepped final assemblies before crating. I wasn't supposed to be there. My badge didn't clear it anymore, but I had a friend on the inside. Hank, big fella with oil under every fingernail and a laugh you could hear over the saws. "Al," he said, leaning in, "you see the new nose cone design? They're rushing it. Cut out 3 inches of support for weight savings." I didn't flinch, just asked, "Did they test it?" He laughed. "They tested it on a chalkboard. Later that week, I saw the blueprint. They'd shaved aluminum where it mattered most. One bad dive and that cockpit would crumple like a tin can. Now I wasn't supposed to care anymore. That's what they were banking on, and that I'd gotten the message. Stay in your lane, keep your head down, don't ask. But that ain't how I was built. So I did what I always did. I went home, poured myself some day-old coffee, and stayed up drawing. Red lines, arrows, notes in the margins. I mapped out every stress point, every bolt torque, every heat fluctuation that might cause a fracture. And I mailed it, not to my supervisor, not to engineering. I sent it straight to the Air Safety Evaluation Office in Pennsylvania. No name, no return address, just the diagrams. It wasn't the first time I bent the rules. Wouldn't be the last. But I wasn't doing this for a gold star. I was doing this because I'd seen too many names disappear off the locker wall. Names of men who flew what we built. And I wasn't about to sit quiet while we shipped out death traps in patriotic packaging. The fallout came a week later, and it didn't come softly. A new supervisor, young guy, pressed shirt, never had a grease burn in his life, pulled me aside. "Albert, we've reviewed your time logs. Some discrepancies, you understand? You've been lingering in restricted areas, asking questions, working outside assigned parameters." I waited for the punchline. He adjusted his glasses. "Effective immediately, you'll be reassigned to intake inventory. Hangar B, crate logging." That was code for go count boxes and disappear. And for the first time in a long while, I got angry. Not that hot kind of angry that burns out quick. No, the slow, cold kind. The kind that settles in your bones. The kind that watches and remembers. But I nodded. "Yes, sir." Walked out of his office, didn't say a word. They thought they'd buried me, but they didn't realize I'd already planted something, because 2 days later, something strange happened. An inspector from D.C. showed up. Clipboard, federal badge, asked to see production logs, asked about structural changes. Started pulling tail sections off the line for reanalysis. And just like that, the brass upstairs got nervous. You could feel it in the air, the kind of tension that made even the floor bosses keep their mouths shut and their eyes open. No one said my name, but they didn't have to, because every mechanic on that floor looked at me different that day, not like a hero. No, I wasn't looking for that. More like a man who'd done something they were thinking about doing. And now they were wondering if maybe, just maybe, this quiet black mechanic with grease on his sleeves and a busted clipboard knew something the higher-ups didn't. This is the turning point. The moment everything cracks open. You've seen him silenced. Now watch what happens when silence doesn't work. Chapter 3 is where the heat hits the steel. You won't want to miss it. You ever been boxed in? I mean really boxed in, not physically, but in the kind of way where every hallway leads to a closed door and every promotion feels more like a padded cell with better lighting. That was me in Hangar B. They moved me out there under the pretense of restructuring. Said they needed my keen eye for detail, sorting intake crates. What they really meant was, we don't want you near the planes, near the workers, or near anything that breathes hope into this place. Hangar B was where the parts came in before they became anything useful. Stacks of metal, bolts, hydraulic pumps, landing gear pieces, all tagged, logged and stored under flickering lights and the constant hum of forklifts. The only thing louder was the silence they wrapped around me. No crew, no assistant, just me, a pen, a clipboard, and cold concrete. For most men, that would have been the end of the road. But I wasn't most men. See, there's something dangerous about putting a thinking man in a quiet room. That's where ideas hatch. That's where the gears start turning, and once they do, good luck stopping them. So I watched. I paid attention to the shipments, where they came from, who signed off on them, which ones were marked urgent, even when they looked like leftovers from last year. I noticed how some of the landing gear units had hairline cracks right out of the crate. How pressure valves from the secondary supplier failed torque tests even before they hit the assembly floor. And you know what else I noticed? Nobody said a word. Not upstairs. Not on the floor. Not in the logs. So I started keeping my own. Not to be noble. Not even to get even. Just because somebody had to. That's when I met Sergeant Josephine Clay. She came in looking like she didn't want to be there. And who could blame her? A black woman, wearing a military uniform in a civilian intake hangar. That alone was enough to make every man in that building straighten up and pretend they weren't part of the problem. She had orders to inspect supplier deliveries, special assignment from the Army Air Forces, temporary, internal, discreet. I nodded when she introduced herself. Didn't ask questions, but she asked one. You see anything strange with these wheel assemblies? Now, understand, I wasn't looking to spill, not unless someone knew how to listen, but she did, so I told her. Not everything, not yet, just enough. These came in from McKinley & Sons, stamped certified, but half the welds are cold joints. Won't hold up under a hard landing. She didn't flinch, just took notes. Thanks, she said, and walked out like she didn't need to prove a thing. 2 days later, those same parts were recalled. Quietly. No announcement, no emails. Just disappeared from the inventory like they never existed. That's when I knew. I wasn't the only one keeping score. Weeks went by. I kept my head down and my eyes up. Every failed valve, every cracked bracket. I logged it. Then I noticed something else. The reject rate on parts from the main supplier was going up, and suddenly the official floor tests, the ones I used to help run, were giving pass marks to parts that barely held shape. Either the machines were lying, or someone was feeding them numbers they wanted to see. So one night, after hours, I did something I hadn't done since they stripped me of my clearance. I snuck back into Test Bay 3. Don't ask me how. Let's just say you spend 15 years in a building, you learn a few things, like which keys don't change and which locks are more bark than bite. Inside the bay, I found the calibration logs, and that's when the hammer dropped. Every torque wrench had been tampered with. Dialed 2 points higher than standard, which meant a part rated safe at 9,000 psi was really breaking at 7,500. Let me put that in plain terms. Planes were flying with gear that should have failed in testing, and someone made sure it didn't. Now, this wasn't a crack in the system. This was the system. It didn't care about safety. It cared about speed, about quotas, about appearances, about some colonel somewhere getting a ribbon for production efficiency, while pilots got buried with closed caskets. That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat at the kitchen table, same spot I used to work on diagrams, staring at those falsified logs and wondering how deep the hole really went. I didn't know what to do. Not really. Going back through channels wasn't an option. They'd already shut me out once. And this wasn't just bad design anymore. This was cover-up. The next morning I went back to Hangar B like nothing happened. At lunch I found Sergeant Clay standing near the loading dock, clipboard in hand, talking to a logistics officer. I waited. Didn't say a word. Just looked at her when she passed. She stopped. Something wrong with today's shipment? I paused. You still got access to the calibration bay? She raised an eyebrow. Why? Because I think someone wants these planes to look good more than they want them to fly. That got her attention. We didn't talk long. No need to. She knew the tone in my voice. The kind that says, I don't need proof. I already saw the body. The next week was quiet. Too quiet. I worked. She vanished. A few boxes started showing up with odd tags. Hold for inspection. Secondary evaluation. Then a new face showed up in Hangar B civilian clothes. Sharp eyes. Didn't speak much. But I recognized the boots. Government issue. They were watching now, not me. The floor, the flow. The way parts moved, and who signed for what. I didn't know if that was good or bad. All I knew was, they couldn't unsee what had been found. And for the first time in months, I felt something shift. Not victory, but pressure. Not from me pushing, but from the weight pushing back. They tried to box me out. But I was already inside the machine. This is where the real fight begins. You've seen the crack. Now get ready for the break. Chapter 4 will show you what happens when truth leaks out of sealed doors. And it won't be pretty. The day the letter hit the bulletin board, everything changed. Not for them, not right away. But for me, it was like watching the sky crack open over my head. It was a standard factory memo, nothing flashy, no bold ink. Just a half sheet posted next to the break room clock. One of 24 notices nobody ever reads, except this one had a name on it. Effective immediately, all future quality assurance reviews will be conducted solely through approved military auditors. No outside personnel may conduct independent part evaluations. They didn't mention me. Of course not. But everyone knew what it meant. The day before, Sergeant Clay had flagged 3 critical intake lots for secondary testing. Components that should have passed. Components I'd quietly highlighted in my own log. Then, like clockwork, she disappeared. No explanation, no sign-out. Just gone. And now they wanted silence. Not the kind that falls when work is done, but the kind that creeps in like wet cement. Slow, cold, permanent. The kind that says, we're watching now, and we expect you to behave. That afternoon, 2 officers showed up in Hangar B. Not inspectors, not mechanics. Officers, clean uniforms, no oil, no heat stains. One of them had a leather-bound notepad he didn't open once. They didn't ask questions. They just looked. At me, at the crates, at the clipboard I carried like it was still worth something. You're Albert Dole, one of them asked, even though he already knew. Last I checked, I answered, straight-backed, calm. We're reviewing intake procedures. Continue as usual. That line stuck with me. Continue as usual. The problem was, usual meant closing your eyes and stamping metal that might get a young man killed. And I couldn't do that. So I didn't. That night, I made copies. Not of everything, just the worst of it. Calibration records. Shipping discrepancies. 2 supplier invoices that didn't match the weight of what we received. I wasn't a whistleblower. I was a mechanic with eyes, and I'd spent enough time in those hangars to know what metal sounded like when it was about to break. I sent those copies to a contact I remembered from way back, a union man named Calvin Barris. He wasn't military. He wasn't factory brass. He was just one of us, older now, working with veterans boards and engineering guilds. The kind of man who'd seen a lot, said little, but moved mountains when he wanted to. I didn't expect a reply. That wasn't the point. But 3 days later, a phone rang in the break room. The shift supervisor picked it up, nodded without saying much, and then called my name over the intercom. Dole, main office. When I walked in, the air was too still. You ever feel the temperature drop when you walk into a room full of suits? That's what it felt like. Behind the desk sat the plant director. Next to him, 2 military representatives, both tight-lipped, both staring at the manila folder between them like it might bite. Mr. Dole, the director began, using that thin, polite voice people reserve for bad news they don't want to admit is personal. We've reviewed several concerns regarding your conduct. I didn't move, didn't speak. He continued, your presence in restricted areas, your communications with external parties, these actions may constitute a breach of wartime confidentiality. The man to his left, a younger officer, leaned forward. We understand your desire to contribute, but circumventing procedures undermines the chain of command. There it was again. Chain of command. As if truth needed a ranking officer to approve it. I waited a beat, then calmly said, I didn't circumvent anything. I did what I was trained to do. I identified failure points. I logged inconsistencies. I flagged potential defects. Without authorization, the officer snapped. I nodded, because authorization required pretending nothing was wrong. A long silence followed, the kind that told me they didn't expect me to push back. I was supposed to apologize. That was the unspoken script, but I'd already seen too much, so I said nothing. And they dismissed me, suspended, indefinitely. Pending review, no trial, no inquiry. Just a folder, a hallway, and a closed door. I walked out of that office into a sea of workers who didn't ask questions but knew. You can feel it when someone's marked. When the whispers turn into side glances, and the side glances turn into distance. They didn't mean harm, they just didn't want it aimed at them. But something strange happened that day. As I walked back through Hangar B to gather my things, a young mechanic stopped me. Same one I'd helped months ago with the drill press and the shaky hands. He didn't say much, just handed me a note. Folded, no name. I opened it later that night. Inside, a list. Shipment numbers, test results, notes in a different hand, at the bottom, 2 words. You're not alone. That hit me harder than any suspension, because what they never understood, what they still don't, is that ideas don't disappear when you cut off one man. They spread, they grow, they wait. And I realized, sitting at my kitchen table with that note in my hand, that this wasn't the end. They wanted a quiet man. But quiet doesn't fix crashing planes. Now it's not just about one man. The system's cracking, and the people inside it are starting to move. Chapter 5 is coming. You'll want to see how deep this goes. You know what's funny? They thought kicking me out would shut everything down. Like I was the problem. Like removing one man would stop the questions from echoing in the walls. What they didn't count on was momentum. Truth has a habit of walking around, even when you try to lock the door behind it. The day after my suspension, I did what every man in my shoes would do. I went home, sat at the kitchen table and stared at the same cracked coffee mug I'd been drinking from since the war started. Same handle, same chip. Like it was daring me to crack next. But I didn't. I watched the news. Nothing about faulty parts, nothing about audits. Just headlines about increased output and heroes on the home front. All smiles, all medals, not one mention of cracked bolts or forged signatures. Meanwhile, I had a drawer full of records and a head full of names who trusted me to remember them. So I started writing. Not letters, accounts, detailed daily logs. From memory, from notes I wasn't supposed to have. Every failed inspection, every shortcut approved by someone whose boots had never touched factory oil. I wasn't shouting. I was documenting, and I wasn't alone. See, that note I got, "You're not alone." It wasn't just words. It was a sign. Within a week, more showed up. Typed, handwritten, scribbled in pencil margins, left in my mailbox under my car wiper, even slipped into my coat pocket while I stood in line for bread. Each one carried a piece of the puzzle. Test anomalies, flight inconsistencies, maintenance flags that were ignored. They were from workers, mechanics, inspectors, people like me. People who'd stayed silent while I stood up, but now realized they didn't have to sit down forever. And then came the wild card, a name, someone inside the administration, someone still on payroll, someone fed up. The note read, "You didn't hear this from me, but someone upstairs is rewriting compliance logs, quietly, backdating results. And the next batch of aircrafts heading to the Pacific with landing gear built on lies." I remember staring at that line, hands cold, heart pounding in my ribs. Because that wasn't just paperwork anymore. That was people. That was pilots. Boys no older than my son would have been, climbing into machines made of numbers that didn't add up. So I made a decision. I went to the press. Not the front page boys, not the politicians' papers. They wouldn't touch this unless it came with a headline already tied in a ribbon. No, I went to a local veteran-run weekly that still printed truth on cheap ink. The date in Post-Ledger, small office, 2 desks, 1 aging linotype, and a war reporter named Gerald Price who still limped from Tunisia. "You got proof?" he asked, not even looking up from his typewriter. I laid down the folder. "Enough to fill your front page for a month." He lit a cigarette, took one look, didn't ask who I was, just said, "I'll print what I can verify." And he did. 2 weeks later, the story ran under a small headline. "Supplier reports contradicts safety data at Dayton Aircraft Plant." Nothing flashy, no names, no accusations. But it shook the ground like thunder under a sleeping city. That same day, something else happened. Someone tried to break into my apartment. Didn't take anything. Didn't trash the place. Just moved things. A drawer left open, a notebook missing, a single file put back upside down. It was a message. They knew. And I wasn't surprised. Because I knew the game. I'd seen it before in other forms, supervisors who misplaced paperwork, promotions that got delayed, black workers who were reassigned out of sight when they started asking too many questions. But this time, it wasn't just me, and that scared them. At the factory, something shifted. Whispers grew legs. 2 junior inspectors were suddenly on leave. A procurement officer quietly resigned. Internal testing froze for 4 days straight, something that hadn't happened since 41. And then came the visit. Knock on the door, Saturday morning. I opened it, expecting a neighbor. Instead, I saw a man in civilian clothes holding a Department of Defense ID. Name was Elliot Finch. Said he was part of a new oversight task force. Said my name had come up. I let him in. Not because I trusted him, but because hiding wasn't my way. We sat at my kitchen table. He asked questions. I answered. He didn't write anything down, just listened. Patient. Measured. Like someone trained to remember every word. Then he asked, "Why didn't you just walk away?" I leaned back in my chair. Because I built those planes. And if one falls out the sky, because someone in a tie wanted a faster quarter, that blood's on my hands. I don't get to walk away from that. He nodded. That was it. Didn't promise change. Didn't say thank you. Just nodded, got up, and left. But 2 weeks later, things moved fast. The factory received an unannounced audit. 3 suppliers were flagged. An entire batch of landing gear was grounded, and a memo, this time internal, listed a new temporary policy. Reinstate limited advisory access to suspended civilian engineering specialists. Pending case review. That meant me. They weren't apologizing. They were covering. But I didn't need a parade. Just a chance to keep one more name off that wall. And when I walked back into Hangar B, clipboard in hand, grease already on my sleeve, the silence hit different. Not fear, respect. Not because I was special, but because I stayed when walking away would have been easier. This isn't the end. The system's bruised but not broken. And now that the door's cracked, what comes next will test everything. Chapter 6 closes the story. Don't miss how it all lands. I wasn't expecting a phone call. Not after all that. Not after months of silence, blacklisting, and getting my name sliced off rosters like I never existed. But one morning, the line rang. A clipped voice. Official. Unemotional. They wanted me back. Back in the same building. Same badge, same title. They didn't say why, but I knew. Something cracked. Somewhere higher up, someone saw the numbers. Someone noticed the failure rates dropping where my design had been quietly implemented by a few rogue teams who dared to test it anyway. Somebody important realized they'd buried something useful, so they pulled the lever, pretended nothing happened. As if this was just a minor leave of absence and not a silent execution. I said yes. But I wasn't coming back to fit in. I was coming back knowing exactly how the system moved. The first day back, I walked into the hangar like it was a new battlefield. Same faces, same tired eyes. Some wouldn't meet mine. Others gave me the kind of nod you give someone who walked away from a crash you didn't think was survivable. They didn't clap. This wasn't a movie, but they didn't stop me either. The job they gave me was a joke. Monitoring quality on the tail sections. A desk in a corner. No real access to test data. No team to manage. No clearance to make calls. A cage. Painted beige. They figured I'd sit still. Maybe shut up. Be grateful. They forgot something important. I had nothing left to lose. So I started watching. Quietly. Taking notes. Asking questions. Not loud ones. Surgical ones. The kind that make people squirm when they know the answer should be obvious, but isn't. A month in, I caught a shipment of parts being swapped. They called it authorized substitution. I called it a death wish. Another week, I traced a change in documentation flow that redirected test failures out of the reporting stream. They called it streamlining. I called it burying data. And then I saw the one thing I wish I hadn't. My name. Still on documentation for a system I'd never approved. One that was now standard issue. One that had already had 2 near misses nobody wanted to talk about. I didn't blow the whistle. Not yet. Instead, I made coffee, went to meetings, wrote reports with just enough truth to be dangerous, but not enough to be noticed. I waited, let the system breathe, unaware it had a leak. They promoted me. Twice. Apparently, being quiet and cooperative gets you far, especially when they think they broke your spine. What they didn't see was what I was building. I'd spent years thinking truth was enough. That proof wins, that logic persuades. Now I knew better. I wasn't building a case. I was building pressure, and pressure doesn't ask for permission. It waits. And then it explodes. There's a thing that happens when you stop trying to get approval. When you finally realize they're never going to clap, never going to say, "You were right." You start speaking differently, moving differently. You stop asking if it's okay to fix the ship. You just start tightening bolts while they look the other way. I began showing up to engineering briefings uninvited. Not loud, just present. I'd drop questions like pebbles in a still lake. Why does the stress test skip thermal load at 200 hours? Silence. We've always done it that way. Then I'd leave. No fight. Just enough discomfort to ripple through. And then came the test week. 7 aircraft. 5 minor failures. 1 grounding. And a technician, fresh, 24, nervous, who pulled me aside in the hallway and whispered, "Sir, the parts, they're not matching your diagrams." I already knew, but I looked at him like it was new information. Gave him a nod. "Thanks. You did the right thing." That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was scared, but because the pattern was finally clear. They thought reinstating me would settle the dust. They thought a quiet corner and a job title would be enough. But I was already inside, and I wasn't alone anymore. This wasn't the end of my story. This was just the part where they realized I was still moving. And this time, I wasn't asking for a seat at the table. I brought my own plans, and they weren't drawn in pencil. You know what's worse than being ignored? Being listened to, just enough to make it look like they're doing something while actually doing nothing. That's what happened when my memo hit the boardroom. A 2-page document typed up on a Sunday night after I saw flight data I couldn't explain away anymore. 4 separate incidents. All similar, same plane model, same odd spike in actuator temperature, same hesitation in the left rudder input just seconds before a corrective maneuver. Pattern. I wasn't guessing. I was staring at it. Monday morning, I handed it off to someone I trusted in systems, not because I thought it would go somewhere, but because I wanted it on record. 4 hours later, I got called into a cross-functional review. A fancy name for a room full of department heads pretending to be curious. It was me, a pitcher of cold water, and 9 people who hadn't been on a shop floor in months. They let me walk them through the memo, slide by slide. They nodded, took notes, asked safe questions. Then the head of engineering, Ben Glass, cleared his throat. "That's insightful, James, it really is. But we're already implementing minor adjustments in the actuator firmware. This kind of variance should smooth out." He said it like I was pointing out a typo in a manual. I leaned forward. "So, we're just going to write it out? Hope it disappears on its own?" He smiled. "It's not as critical as you think." That's when I realized. They weren't denying it existed. They were minimizing it, diluting it, boxing it in so it wouldn't disrupt timelines. To them, it wasn't about safety. It was about delivery schedules. Client confidence, quarterly reports. They weren't saying no. They were saying later. And in this business, later can be fatal. I walked out of that meeting with 2 things. A copy of the memo with "archived" stamped on it. A gut-deep certainty that if I didn't escalate this, someone would get hurt. So I did what I wasn't supposed to do. I ran the raw flight data through a private sim tool, the one I used back when I was still flying test sequences. I input the same variables, same thermal climb, same rudder input delay. The result? Oscillation, unstable yaw. On the third loop, the plane lost lift. It didn't crash, not in the sim, but if that hesitation had happened 15 seconds later, in a crosswind, you'd be reading about it in the papers. I didn't sleep that night. I was past frustration, past anger. You ever feel like the building you work in is leaning over you? Like every door you open already has a locked one behind it? That was me, trapped inside a system that rewards silence and punishes urgency. So, the next morning I submitted a risk bulletin, a formal step, rarely used. It goes to compliance, then to flight ops, then gets reviewed by legal. It's the kind of form that says, if anything happens, you can't say you didn't know. I hit send at 7:14 a.m. At 8:03, I was reassigned to a different building. They said it was temporary. Broader visibility, they called it. What it really meant. No more access to test data, no flight logs, no pilot feedback loops. Just old case studies, outdated models, and coffee that tasted like cardboard. They moved me out of the storm. And that's how you know the storm was real. They think people like me run on credit. That we'll take the illusion of being heard over actually being listened to. They're wrong. We don't need a podium. We need a lever. And when that lever shows up, even if it's disguised as a breakdown or an accident, I'll be ready to pull it. Hard. I wasn't supposed to be in the hangar that day. That was the whole point of moving me. Keep me away from the test team, from the data, from the people who still asked the right questions. But they underestimated something basic. You don't box out someone who helped build the floor plan. I knew the blind spots. I knew which badge still opened which doors. And most of all, I knew the one person still inside who hadn't forgotten what mattered. Lucas met me at the north entrance at 06:10. No questions, no hesitation. 15 minutes, Max, he said, eyes scanning for cameras. I didn't answer, just walked in. The hangar smelled like burned metal and hydraulic oil. That smell of urgency wrapped in silence. The new prototype stood in Bay 3, Flight Tail 17A. It had flown twice that week, and I hadn't seen a single log. That wasn't just abnormal, it was deliberate. Lucas handed me a printout. No digital trace, he muttered. The file was stripped. No pilot names, no timestamps. Just raw telemetry and system triggers. It was worse than I thought. At 14,000 feet, mid-turn, the rudder override had spiked. Again. Almost identical to the 4 incidents I'd logged before. Same left delay lag, same lateral compensation from the onboard AI, same forced correction to avoid a spiral. And yet, it hadn't been flagged. That wasn't just a glitch. That was a cover. You need to see this too, Lucas added, sliding over a thermal scan of the actuator casing. I froze. The material wasn't holding temp. At 250 degrees, it began to deform, microfractures spreading outward. It wasn't just a systems issue anymore. It was structural. If the actuator failed mid-climb with a lateral roll in play, the wing wouldn't stabilize. The plane would yaw, then drop. That's not a hypothesis. That's math. Where's this going? I asked. Lucas looked down. Ben's team. They rerouted all reports through internal QA. No one outside that loop sees full diagnostics. There it was. Full lockdown, no external reviews, no risk team, no compliance flags. Someone made sure the warning bells stayed silent. I walked the edge of the hangar. Every step felt louder than it should have. Every tool cart, every grounded wire, familiar but now distant. That's what exile does. It doesn't put you far away. It puts you just close enough to remember what you've lost. And I'll be honest, a part of me wanted to walk out. Just leave. Let the machine spin. Let someone else pay the price. But that's the luxury of people who never sign their name next to a line that says test pilot feedback. That's the privilege of those who've never read the word failure next to a friend's name. Back at my desk, my new cage in Building D, I drafted a report. Not a memo, not an email. A formal notice to the Aviation Safety Board. Outside the company. Yes, that's a line. Yes, crossing it burns bridges. But bridges are only useful if they take you somewhere worth going. I used my full name. I attached the actuator data, the thermal scans, and the anonymized telemetry. Then I added one sentence. 4 near incidents are not coincidence. They are ignored warnings. I saved it, encrypted it, and scheduled it to send in 72 hours. Why the delay? Because I wanted to give them a chance. Not Ben, not the execs. The ones who still cared. The few inside the loop who had a spine and just needed a reason to use it. The next morning, I walked past the hangar again. Ben was there. White shirt, no tie. Clipboard in hand, eyes full of calculation. He didn't see me. Or maybe he did, and pretended not to. Either way, the message was clear. Stay gone. But here's the thing. I wasn't back for him. I was back for the machine, for the process, for the people whose names would never make it into press briefings, but who would be the first ones blamed if that plane dropped. So, no, I didn't crash any gates. I didn't yell. I didn't blow whistles in the hallway. I just stood there, clipboard in hand, like I belonged, because once I did. And maybe I still do. By noon the next day, the silence became a message. No calls, no emails, no, let's talk this through. Nothing. That's how they play it. Not with confrontation, with erasure. As if cutting your access makes you disappear, as if pretending you never existed changes what you know. But something had shifted. Not in them, in me. And it wasn't going back in the box. At 12:47 p.m. the report was viewed. External access, verified by the logs. Downloaded twice, opened once. And then, silence again. But this wasn't the kind of silence that lasts. This was the calm before someone decides to choose a side, and not all of them choose safety. I spent the next hour walking, not pacing, walking, deliberate, methodical, through the outer halls of the old R&D wing, past shuttered labs and workbenches that hadn't seen daylight in months, ghosts of ideas that never made it, not because they were wrong, but because someone with a louder voice said no. I stopped outside testing Bay 6. It used to be mine. 5 years ago, we built the 10-second fuel recalibrator here. The same one that shaved 3% off burn rate during rapid descent. They use it now without ever crediting the original team. That's how this place works. Take your ideas, strip your name, move on. But I hadn't come to reminisce. I came because Lucas had sent one line an hour earlier. They grounded Tail 17. No explanation, no announcement, just quietly pulled from rotation. That wasn't protocol. That was fear. I called him. He answered on the second ring. You've got 10 seconds. Was it Ben? Pause. Yes, but he wasn't alone. That hit harder than I expected. I knew Ben would fight it. What I didn't expect What I hoped wouldn't happen was someone else co-signing it, someone I used to respect, someone I trained. "You're not safe here anymore," Lucas said flatly. I didn't respond, because he was wrong. I'd never been safe. Not since the first time I told a superior, "We need to rethink this wing load balance." Safety was never part of the deal, but truth was, at 3:12 p.m. my terminal access was revoked. Not just my old folders, everything. Email, reports, time clock, even my ID badge was stripped from the system. Just like that, I didn't exist. But see, that's the problem with closing the door on someone like me. I don't need your door. I built the back entrance. By 5 p.m., the safety board had replied. Formally, on the record, requesting a full recorded statement and asking for live interview availability. Not next week. Not when convenient. Tomorrow. And suddenly, I understood. Why they went quiet, why they froze the logs, why Ben hadn't confronted me in person. Because they knew. They weren't dealing with a disgruntled employee. They were dealing with someone who had the receipts, and the nerve to show them. So I cleared the last of my files, the real ones on my encrypted drive, and went home, and for the first time in months, I slept. Not because it was over, but because something had finally begun. 3 a.m. I was already seated in the conference room before they buzzed the line. Remote call, 4 screens, 2 from the safety board, 1 from legal oversight, and 1 unnamed. No label, just a blinking light. No one said hello, no one asked how I was. It started with, "Mr. Callan, are you aware the session is being recorded?" I nodded. "Absolutely. I requested it." That threw them off just enough for the silence to stretch a little too long, so I leaned forward. "You'll want to start on page 17. That's where it stops being a theory and starts being a cover-up." For the next 42 minutes I talked. No emotion, no dramatics, just the line by line. How the tail rudder miscalibrations had been showing up in 3 different test flights. How the diagnostics were getting manually overridden. How I'd sent the warning 3 times, flagged it twice, and was locked out of the system on the 4th. I dropped names. I cited timestamps. I read verbatim from the internal chat logs they thought were deleted. Then I paused, leaned back, and said, "You already knew some of this, didn't you?" The unnamed box blinked. Still no ID, still no face. But then, the voice, female, measured, sharp. We had suspicions, but nothing actionable. That's what they always say. Nothing actionable. Until someone bleeds, until a wing breaks apart in midair. But not this time. Because this time, someone talked before it happened. At 9:01 a.m. the call ended. I walked out of the room without a word. Didn't look back. Didn't need to. They'd seen everything they needed. The message wasn't in the documents. It was in the way I stood my ground, the way I didn't beg to keep my job, the way I made sure my name was on the record next to the truth. I was halfway to the parking lot when my phone buzzed. Blocked number. I answered. A voice I hadn't heard in years. "Callan, it's Whitmore." I stopped walking. He continued. "Didn't think you had it in you, not like that." "I didn't either," I said. Pause. "You're going to get calls. Some will sound like offers. They're not. They're warnings." Then he hung up. By noon, 5 emails hit my personal inbox. 3 from defense contractors, 1 from a congressional aide, and 1 from a name I hadn't seen since grad school. Subject line, "It's bigger than just one aircraft." No text. No attachments, just that. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't the end of a fight. It was the start of a chain reaction. Because once someone breaks silence, it doesn't echo. It multiplies. At 5:16 p.m., I stood on the ridge above the old hangar. The sun was low, wind steady. Down below, they were towing out Tail 17. She looked different now, not because they fixed her, because they finally saw her. Not as a line item, not as a number in a maintenance log, but as a machine carrying lives. They tried to erase me. They tried to discredit the data. They tried to lock the doors and say, "This is how it's always been done." But they forgot one thing. The truth flies. And this time, it wasn't flying alone.